Hi, welcome. This is Rooney 207. Thank you so much for coming back, and those new subscribers, welcome. For this edition, we're going to talk about the SOC2, the AICPA's framework for the service organization control. This is regarding the trust service principle. Essentially, if you're a gamer and you play the traditional Web 2 game, you don't really care whether the company has long-term viability or longevity or sustainability, or their financials or their internal controls over financial reporting is relevant or not, because you're just there. You just want to play the very best the fun games that you could potentially get some nice skins and things like that, and things that you can flex. As you kind of move to the Web 2.1 all the way to potentially Web 2.5, I don't think there's a Web 3 game out there. So as you invest more and more of your money, your time, and your resources, you'll probably should consider some of these elements, because you're no longer just playing for fun. You're actually there's an earnings mechanics, and the more that you put skin on the table, skin in the game, and the more financial assets you put into it, the more you acquire, you'll have concerns and you'll have questions, and you want to ensure that you want to limit your rug pull. You want to make sure that the company that you're continuing to put more and more your money into it, you'll want to make sure that their balance sheet is strong, they have strong leadership, they have a good board of directors. You understand that the DAO itself, you want to understand the transparency around the DAO, where it's incorporated, who signs the signatures for the DAO. And as part of the vendor management and the partnership process, when you look at it, you want to make sure that the company you invest in also cares about security. And so the piece that we're looking at, it's a service organization control that's completed by a CPA firm, and it could be any accounting firms around the world. They use similar standards, and they follow the five trust service principles around security, confidentiality, availability, processing, integrity, and privacy. We're not going to cover all of them in this particular video. I'll try to cover as much as I can for the security principle. Security is the biggest one out of the five, because it's pervasive, and it's something that we're all concerned about. For instance, if we play Splinterlands, we're concerned about the Hive keychain and how the security around that works, and the elements that goes into it. And we want to make sure that Splinterlands, the company Steam Monster, they take care and due diligence in the process, and they look after your account. They implement good internal controls, and these are some of the ones that you want to look at. And I'll just cover the CC is for the common criteria, because security is pervasive, and the COSO is a enterprise risk management framework that I believe it was established in 1992 or so, with James Threadway and the AICPA and other accounting organizations. Could be the Institute of Internal Audit too. I can't remember. And essentially, they're the committee of organizations, and they're they form the enterprise risk management framework. An example that when you're looking at it from an auditor perspective, you want to look at the various elements. So the first principle is the entity demonstrates a commitment to integrity and ethical values. You definitely want that. You want tone at the top. You want to make sure that leadership, the board, is really focused on this particular area. And the way this is an example of what I would typically do is spend the time to walk a company through this process for if they were to complete the service organization two. type 1 or type 2. The difference is that type 1 is the design element of it. It's design, and type 2 is the testing for the operating effectiveness. So we just want to first look to make sure that the controls are in place and when they're in place, and then to what range we can test the cover period for these types of controls. So for the entity, we have I believe five controls we're looking at. And if you look at the top column here, we can just go through one set. So we have the control description. Then we look at a sample test script, how we're planning to test it. And it may be modified slightly, but these are fairly generic in nature and can be universally applied. The type of test that was performed, excuse me, the results of the test, if it's applicable to the engagement sum. Some controls may be scoped out, and it may not be relevant depending on the size of the organization, the nature and the type of organization it is. And if it's covered by other SSAE, I think 16 or 18 reports, it could be 18, the latest one version. And the control owners and who performed it, the type of documents that was requested and supplied, the status of the control, if there's a gap or remediation. And this is just working through with management. If you're in the technology organization and you're conducting the IT self-assessment, control self-assessment to help prepare the readiness for the SOC 2, you would want to document these things, management's response, and their remediation plan. These are the columns as we go through. They would, but for the purposes of this overview introduction, I'll just cover the quick points to the control description, the test scripts, and things like that. So we can go through. The organization demonstrates commitment to integrity and ethical values by operating under a code of business conduct and ethics. So essentially, you want to ensure that the company has a corporate ethics code of conduct, and that's part of what you're looking at here. Is that you want to talk to the operations IT director or compliance coordinator, and sometimes if it's a small enough organization like Splinterlands, it could be that. It could be PJ, the CTO, to make sure. And the test script is only relevant if we're actually conducting a test and things like that. But essentially, we would request a copy of the code of business conduct. The second piece is the employees are required to take an online training upon employment on an annual basis that covers the company's code of conduct. Employment offers are contingent on a receipt of satisfactory background check, including drug screen, reference, and criminal check, educational and professional employment and credential verification. Utilizes a corporate compliance hotline. So this one, I think a lot of the public companies have this in place, but not necessarily for every smaller company regards to this. So you can see the maturity of an organization if they have something like this in place. Rules of behavior for customers and vendors are communicated to external users, including the public website. Changes and updates are communicated to the external users, customers, and vendors via customer service announcement. So this is kind of similar, depending on the maturity of the company. They may or may not have that. And as you'll notice with the smaller gaming companies or the larger ones, I think Gala will probably be the example because I believe they're the largest one, and they're also building a variety of gaming structure. So they're more taking a diverse portfolio view of this, and they're just throwing games that hit the top 10 gaming genre. I think they have 8 of the top 10 gaming genre gala so far, and they're just looking at it as a kind of a spray across and see what hits, see what player base and see what games grow. So I think like Gala is an example where you probably want to invest in their token, not necessarily the specific games, because they're taking more of like a traditional Web2 game. So players may stop playing the game and it may go away. Versus, I think a company like Splinterlands, they're smaller and they're also looking at it from more of a Web2 perspective. I'm sorry, more from a Web3 perspective, and they're looking to grow and develop and add and augment the assets so things are more repeatable and reusable within the ecosystem. The second the second common criteria, 1.2, the COSO principle number 2, for the committee sponsoring organization there. The board of directors demonstrates independence from management and exercises oversight of the development and performance of internal control. So this is the board of directors are not establishing oversight responsibilities. Board of directors are not applying relevant expertise. The board of directors are not operating independently from management. The board of directors are not providing oversight for the system of internal controls. So that's part of the risk of the component of this. And then what you want to look at is that the executive management identifies and accepts its oversight responsibilities. Executive management defines, maintains. So this is another example of tone from the top. You want to make sure that the board is directly aware of what's happening and they're fully aware of their internal management and independent structure. The executive management would utilize subcommittees or consultants to further enhance the internal controls knowledge. And this is a lot of it is education. A lot of board of directors are not necessarily knowledgeable when it comes to information security, internal controls, and internal audit. I think privacy is a new one that's been recently added to the board of directors knowledge deck, and because of that, they have to augment their education, and they'll just receive additional knowledge to learning experience. The third principle here, management establishes with board oversight structure, reporting lines, and appropriate authorities and responsibilities. So the organization has a org chart, and I think with Splinterlands they talked about the org chart. There's an HR function and things like that, and I'm sure there's a job description. It's based on some of the town halls that we've talked about. On an annual basis, policy makers and owners review their policies and necessary updates, written descriptions of their job. Let's see. The fourth one here has established security standards for infrastructure and software hardening and configuration that include requirements for implementation of access control software, hardening standards, firewalls, and things like that. This part, I think there's been references talked about, but I don't know if it's been officially defined within the Splinterlands universe. The fourth principle, the entity demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals in alignment with objectives. I think based on the town hall, I believe that Matt, Aggie, Dennis, PJ, Hardpoint, those guys, I think they've demonstrated that they do have a history of that, of this piece. So I imagine just based on some of the feedback, and I think they do implement these structures, I believe. And as they're going through their I believe they're kicking off their PI. So Splinterland's team would have something like this in place, I believe. In terms of senior management develop contingency plans for assignment of responsibilities important for internal controls. I'm not sure how much redundancy, overlap, or backup and things like that. I believe it's a smaller team, so it would not surprise me if there's some gaps here and there on that aspect. The fifth principle: the entity holds individuals accountable for their internal control responsibilities in the pursuit of objectives. So this one here has a responsibility. I believe through their project initiatives, I believe they do this in terms of they don't have someone running information security at the moment. So I would imagine that PJ would serve in that capacity, and they'll probably interact with HR to develop this plan. Here, internal controls, the director of corporate. I don't think they have a corporate compliance either. It's probably integrated and falls on PJ as well. I'd imagine something like that. I don't think they have a IT compliance person. The this is moving towards communication and information, the second part of the common criteria. So this is referring to the COSO 13, principle number 13. So there, maybe one of these days we'll kind of cover the COSO principles and how it stacks up how information technology is just one line item of the COSO element within the enterprise risk management structure. And also, COSO is relied upon heavily by the finance and accounting team as a framework. For this one, the entity obtains or generates and uses relevant quality information to support the functioning of internal controls. So this one is about building the systems infrastructures in place to identify the information and they support the functioning of the internal control achievement of the entity's objective. Description of information systems and applications are maintained within the enterprise-wide applications and system inventory tools. Everyone has a different management depending on if you have some are more automated than others and some centralized and some are larger and some may be even incorporated within their GRC tool, the governance risk compliance tool or controls. All users and their assigned roles and privilege applications are reviewed on a semi-annual basis. Some companies do it as needed or annual, depending on the size of the business. But I think it's important to at least document and talk about it. I imagine that now Splinterlands has moved to from a waterfall. Their change management process, I believe they would have this covered. Application are being audited. I'm not sure to what extent this is. I'm not sure they're using any type of pen test, even at the infrastructure level. I'm not sure if they hired a third party and things like that. We'll have to kind of look through it. The application being audited, again, I'm not 100% sure on this. The system documents piece, customer, yeah, I don't know about these. Yeah, I think this particular area we'll just have to see when Splinterlands goes through, and these are all kind of optional depending on the type of systems and changes and things like that. The COSO Principle 14, the entity communicates information including objectives and responsibilities for internal controls necessary to support the functioning of the internal control environment itself. This is for the documents. They basically have a policy and in place, and then some of them have procedures for the security of the internal control. employees receive training. A lot of the control description, they do repeat a number of them throughout this exercise, and also it's reflect it maps because some control description may satisfy multiple control criteria, and so that's normal in the world of auditing in terms of like some of them you just test once and it most likely comply many the similar control criteria. Let's see. This is the internal corporate's standard operating procedures. Provide information on how to report incidents and concerns related to breaches. I'm not sure if Splinterlands has something like this, but they do have something on the customer end for the users, for the player community. So I believe they have it for the community. I don't know if internally they have it. Maybe they have a Slack or some way, but I don't know if there's a. I know in Discord it's reachable. Client has established activity diagrams around processing of information handling. I think these are just procedures reporting availability on here. Let's see, client. Employees and contractors are required to complete the client annual security awareness training. So I think this is important. At minimum, it gets us thinking. It also helps us to train. A lot of times, security is just like anything else. It's just practice. Then the more times we're exposed to it, the better off we become. And I think customers are the same way, player based, where a lot of us we don't really think to take security measures. So within the town hall, it's good that it gets repeated and that process, and we're reminded of it. Employees are required to take an online training similar. These are similar to instances of employee non-compliance write-up. So this is having that stand up the information security policy and the department to kind of review that. So I don't know in this absence if it falls on PJ and the HR team to do this piece for Splinterlands. In scope systems, processes have formalized issue resolution procedure. This is the SOP for security, and some of them in terms of the security incident event management tool. Everyone uses different ones. Some use the default Microsoft environment for it. Let's see here, Director of Compliance. Third, related party and vendor agreements are modified to reflect changes in confidentiality practices and commitments. I don't know to what extent Splinterlands, but they do have an NDA in place. Related party and vendor system are subject to review. I think this is part of it where I believe some of the third-party vendors like Splex, PeakD, and others, Splinterlands, Sea Monster, may view it as they're just taking their data and the players agree to it and they give them their one of the posting keys perhaps, and then they'll just work with them. I think that it might be good as the game grows, the environment grows, to consider having those other companies to undergo some form of SOC 2 as well. It gets them to think about it, they think through it, and depending on the dollar amount and things like that, at the minimum, just to do a type 1 or to do a self-assess some level. The 15th principle, the entity communicates with external parties regarding matters affecting the functioning of internal controls. Yeah, I don't know to what extent Splinterlands have a process in place for it. They may or may not. Let's see here. This before personal information is collected, the entity communicates to the internal and external users the purpose and use of the collection of personal information, including detailed use, ability to opt out, enhancements, or inference, sharing, disclosure, access, security. So this covers the use of information and the handling of it, the transfer, the escalation procedures for it. The third part of the common criteria is the risk assessment piece, and this falls on the sixth principle of the COSO ERM. So the sixth element there. The entity specifies objectives with sufficient clarity to enable the identification and assessment of risk related to objectives. So this is I don't know to what extent Splinterlands has conducted a risk assessment piece of this, or even a smaller company like League of Kingdoms the other game I play out. I don't think they've conducted this piece of it. I think in general leadership they have an idea of what their risk appetite and what risk they're facing. I think it's good to document it because then the next level of leadership below the CEO and the founders, they'll have a perspective on it. Let's see this one here. Let me see if it's number 7. The entity identifies risk to the achievement of its objectives across the entity and analyzes risk as a basis for determining how the risk should be managed. So I think this is part of an annual assessment. Perhaps maybe the Splinterlands team can integrate this into their annual process of management meeting, like the one they had earlier prior year in Florida, things like that. The principle 8, the entity considers the potential for fraud, assessing risk. This is fraud risk piece of the equation. I think it's important from a vendor standpoint, and also looking at it potentially from a user base. Number 9, the entity identifies and assesses the changes that could significantly impact the system of internal controls. This is integrated into the annual basis as well. And a lot of the smaller companies, they have a tiny baby risk assessment program they can use to determine this piece as well. The the fourth piece of the common criteria is the monitoring activities, and the 16th principle: the entity selects, develops, and performs ongoing and or separate evaluations to ascertain whether the components of internal control are present and functioning. Basically, the company, the entity, maintains an internal audit function, and a lot of times, smaller companies will say their tax firm is their outsourced audit firm, and I'm not sure if the tax firm agrees with that positioning, but some may take that position. I think it's good to assess whether they can outsource it or not, or delegate it to the CPA firm, and maybe perhaps the CPA firm will take it on as an incremental small but cost. But I'm not sure how they feel about it, because many times a tax firm is not equipped to be the audit firm, or even to help with the internal audit function of it. So sometimes it's good for the board to look at potentially hiring a director of internal audit, even an outsourced firm or an individual, with the proper experience and background. I think as they grow, it's good too because I think as it helps to increase the reputation and the awareness, the brand of the company. So I think in terms of internal controls, it's a great best practice. It's something that all growing, mature companies should strongly consider. And then, as investors of and as gamers, we should look to invest in companies that are committed to these paths because at the end of the day, you want responsible companies, and this is one of the ways that they can express their I guess their best practices or the fact that they care about the game. This one, it's similar to the one on the top here for 17, the evaluation and communication of the internal control deficiencies in a timely manner so that the senior leadership and the board can take appropriate action. I believe this is just putting in the process in place. The control activities is the next common criteria. COSO Principle 10, the entity selects and develops control activities that contribute to the mitigation of risk to the achievement of the objectives to acceptable levels. So this is about risk mitigation and acceptance, and on an annual basis, policy owners they'll review the policies that's appropriate to their department, and then they'll either upload it on the company's SharePoint, or they'll have a GRC tool to kind of track it. And some people may view SharePoint as a GRC tool for smaller businesses and things like that. Automate policy renewals piece on an annual basis, evaluate to review it. The Principle 11, the entity also selects and develops general control activities over technologies to support the achievement. And I think technology is a core principle of security, and also to ensure that policies are reasonably implemented and reviewed. Approved policies cannot be edited. I think that's the security piece of it. Automating the annual process. This one, Principle 12, the entity deploys control activities through policies and establishes what is expected and in procedures that put policies in actions. This is kind of going through the same thing on an annual basis and performing the functions and looking at any differences. The common criteria, the next section, logical and physical access controls. The entity implements logical access security software infrastructure and architectures over protected information assets to protect them from security events to meet the entity's objectives. So for this one here, I think depending on where they are, I think role-based access control is pretty evolved in terms of to be able to achieve in a mature manner. So I think looking at the identity and access management system, and looking at what's in scope and developing and aligning that to the application itself. I think that's an important first step. And then creating a team around that to be able to maintain the governance of that process, the approval and the assignment and the change controls around the role-based access control system. I think it's a good start. Every company goes through, I think smaller companies will struggle in this area, and usually it's just documentation is a good start. And this is for like user IDs, passwords within the system to look at that. Default passwords are changed upon installation. That's really where some of the vulnerabilities are, and then in the applications and the network. Public access points to look at that. Let's see. Use of portable media, electronic. I think that's always a challenge when you have employees, especially within a remote work environment. Is that you may not necessarily turn off their access completely. They may have access to certain applications, and if you believe that their access to your network is required to access the application, sometimes it's not, and many times technology people may not necessarily be aware of it. So basically, the application owner needs to be able to turn off the access as well. So there should be a ticketing or a way to both turn off the network, at the operating system level and things like that, and along with the application. And it's hard as especially as employees like transfer. So it's a transfer of the employees. They may still hold other access from their previous roles, their legacy access. Data written to remote servers, removable USB and things like that to hard drives. So those are at times troublesome, and they're hard to go through and hard to reach completeness on that. Disposing of removable media appropriately. Prior to issuing system credentials and granting access, the entity registers and authorizes new internal and external users whose access is administered by the entity. For those users whose access is administered by the entity, user system credentials are removed when the user access is no longer needed. So this is something like sometimes a fire call procedure is helpful to establish in the event that someone just needs it for a short period of time, things like that, in the absence of a longer, more permanent access. And it's just a way to review this process and to get it completed. The entity authorizes, modifies, or removes access to data, software functions, and other protected information assets based on roles. This kind of goes back to the roles and responsibility piece of it to make sure that their access level is appropriate and commensurable within their job description and their function. And this is just to track, review, and approve, make sure that they're properly. The physical access badge, I think remote workers may not have as big of a deal in this. Most of the Web3 companies strive to perform most of the work remotely across the world. So I think physical access may not be as large of a risk versus others that come in on a daily basis into an office. The entity discontinues the logical and physical protections over physical assets only, and this is similar to the other ones here. I think maybe where it comes in would be vendors too. Vendors, especially like data centers, they're you give them access to your data center and give them logs and things like that. So it's important to revoke that or have it expired or create a fire call type structure. Security management, threats, outside resources. I think this is kind of similar over the logical security and access piece of it, and stored in encrypted formats. Yep. So the most encryption plays a very important critical role as we move data. So I think when data is at rest is one thing, and then when data is in transport, you definitely, and many companies. It's very difficult to manage the encryption when the data is actually moving. The entity restricts transmission, movement, and removal of information to authorize internal and external users and process, and protects its transmission, movement, or removal to meet the entity's objectives. Kind of similar. Goals to prevent and act upon the introduction of unauthorized, and this is just putting in good security hygiene, having a security team, having a SIEM, and having antivirus and things like that in place. Periodic scans, ensuring that your laptops and endpoint devices are properly reviewed. The next common criteria here, it's system operations. To meet its objectives, the entity uses detection and monitoring procedures to identify changes to configuration and susceptibilities to newly discovered vulnerabilities. This is part of your monitoring and configuration vulnerability management piece. So this is just minimizing your attack vectors, just minimizing all the devices and the tools that can be vulnerable to by bad actors. And this is the monitoring aspect of that. And every customer will have their own standard operating procedure, and some organizations and tools may require a custom, not a generic procedure. Let's see, this is your around the security events for breaches and things like that. Let's say standard. As you can see, the number of controls for security, the criteria description is pretty large, and I'm trying to go through it as just quickly as possible, just to kind of give you a flavor of what it could be. And so this one here is the responding to the incidents, the security incident, and some of the SOPs that you'll have to have in the formal documentation, and then so it's important for companies to establish at least a minimal framework for business continuity (BCP) planning, to either use a tool or use a document where you have the emergency contacts, you have a way to recover, and then the disaster recovery piece is at the technology level. The BCP could be at the business level, the leadership. It could be transfer authority and things like that. So it's just good to have some kind of framework in place to at least put it in consideration as companies mature. As we evaluate, these are kind of good contingency planning, good conversation with leadership as we continue to play these games and evaluate the importance to them. The entity identifies, develops, implement activities to recover from identified security incidents. I think this one is kind of along the same line here. So the eighth one is change management. Change management is a very important attribute and a process, and I think having a change review board and having UA testing, things like that, having QA folks, I think having the ability to back out of systems. So these are important pieces. Let's see. I think some of these, probably whoever's doing the Scrum Master, and they should be very familiar with this with all the changes for the change management process. Especially around databases and things like that. Sometimes on the Tuesday update, it may not go. I think a few times it didn't go exactly, so they had to figure out how to back out of it, and that's an example of they had to have a procedure in place. The ninth common criteria is around risk mitigation. The entity identifies, selects, and develops risk mitigation activities for risk arising from potential business disruption. I think it's important to consider at the executive and the board level, all the big risk items, the high medium risk items that the business will be subjected to. An example would be like AWS shutting down. What do they do? Things like that. Or if the high blockchain is no longer replicating or updating properly, or it's just taking too long and things like that, the replication. This is part of the good enterprise risk assessment program to build it in. Let's see. And then this one is around the entity assesses and manages risk associated with vendors and business partners. And I think this is something I realize like maybe Aggie may not want to talk about Splex and Peak D and some of the other ones, but I think at some point he's going to have to look at them as vendors, and maybe we'll look at the relationship differently. And I think this is at a high level. This covers all the key areas. It's quite a large number, and it takes typically it takes the business 3 to 6 months to kind of go through the security piece, the document, and get things in ready in good enough shape to have either the population for the type 1 from the design standpoint, or to be able to produce sample sizes to be able to pull these populations from whatever covered period that the entity would like to go through. And then we can cover the other 4 areas here: the confidentiality, the process integrity, availability, and privacy in later videos. But just wanted to give you a glimpse into what the world of SOC 2 and the trust service principles and the security piece of it. And this concludes this, and look forward to other videos, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you.